We're going to look at the life of Brother Robert Roberts. An entirely different person, but nevertheless in tune with the wonderful things of God. And in the providence of God was really established to do a different work from Brother Thomas, but a remarkable man indeed. Brother Collier wrote a book. If you haven't read this book, it's well worth reading. A study of life and character of Robert Roberts. And he starts off his book with a description of the man, so I thought I would do a similar kind of thing. He was portly. I don't know why that's important, but Brother Collier felt that was part of the description of Brother Roberts. He wasn't a tall man. He was of florid complexion. He had a red and straggling beard and moustache, dark hair, oiled and brushed back, deep-set, penetrating eyes, but was short-sighted. In other words, he was human, very much human, and I think Brother Collier records that for us to appreciate that. But the two important points he makes is firstly, that he was a man who loved his Bible and gave his whole life to the furthering of an understanding of it. And you only have to read his works and to read his life story, and he is an amazing individual. And he had this very deft ability, says Brother Collier, to be able to turn any conversation toward the Scriptures in a very artless kind of way, very natural kind of way. So you could be talking about any subject, and the next 2 or 3 minutes you'd be talking the biblical perspective of that. And it wasn't forced or artificial. And Brother Collier was deeply impressed with that, because it really is a mark of a man whose focus is upon God. And you don't feel like you're being preached to. It's just a natural way the discussion goes. And I thought that was a significant factor in describing Brother Roberts. Well, he was born in Aberdeen. He's a Scotsman. Brother Thomas was born in London. Brother Roberts was born in Scotland. And his father was a seaman. Nothing to do with Brother David, Sister Gwen, but being a seaman, he was often absent from home. And therefore, really, Brother Roberts was brought up by his mother. His mother was educated in London. She was a school teacher, and she taught school in Aberdeen. And there on the screen there, we have an old picture of his birthplace in Links Street, Aberdeen. Aberdeen there on the map, the northern part, or the middle part of Scotland. So it's from the other end of England that this man was brought to bear in the things of God. In 1839, it's a different world that we appreciate. Victoria had been on the throne for 3 years. Photographs have been invented. With the puff of smoke and the phosphorus. That's why they had these grim looks, because it took almost 30 seconds for the negative to develop. So you weren't allowed to hold a smile, and therefore you frowned, because it was easier to frown than it was to smile. And that was the art of photography in those days. And tea was first introduced to Britain. Imagine that. We always think the British to be tea drinkers from the days of Boadicea. Well, that wasn't the case. It was first introduced in 1839. Charles Darwin was elected to the Royal Society. The British had recently captured Hong Kong from the Chinese. And what about this one? Prussia limits the working week of children to 51 hours. Whew. And the population of Aberdeen was 60,000. So it wasn't a large town. And that's the world that Robert Roberts was born into. An entirely different world than we are used to as such. But in those harsh times, wonderful things were born. It's interesting that the Brother Bernard mentioned that Brother Thomas was receiving his biblical perspective from his mother, a love of the Scriptures, and it was also too with Robert Roberts. My mother, he says, was a superior woman of an energetic and strongly religious turn of mind. In the providence of God, these two men were given an atmosphere of godly biblical teaching without really understanding what the Bible said. And that reverence for the Scriptures allowed them to be able later on to take hold of the truth. He writes this: "My father's circumstances were very lowly, and my mother had many difficulties to cope with in the rearing of a large family. She successfully mounted them all in measure. She gave us all a moderate education and brought us up in a strict separation from loose and frivolous neighbours. Home was, however, rather a place of wholesome discipline than of love's comfort, though my mother was not wanting on that side when other things were right. So it was a disciplined environment. And the frivolous neighbours, they were not to be actually joined with. They were kept separate. And the mother therefore had a very strong control, a religious control, over this very poor and lowly family. Brother Thomas was educated in a professional manner. Brother Roberts was on the other end of the scale. He describes himself as having a very moderate education, and this is the Baptist Chapel in Aberdeen, John Street, Aberdeen. It's now boarded up. I tried to get some more recent photographs, but apparently it has been demolished. But that's where they attended, the chapel there. And the preacher, says Brother Roberts, Mr. Hart, was an eccentric sort of man. He was but a soldier, and he made his money at christenings at 2 and 6 a head. Well, there is the religion of money. And it was just part of society, that you earned your money at 2 bob a head. At the age of 10, Brother Roberts first came in contact with Brother Thomas, although he really had no real recollection. In fact, he fell asleep during the meeting. And all he remembers, he says, is the beard. That's all he remembered. That fascinated him as a 10-year-old boy. And there's the chapel where Brother Thomas gave that address to hundreds of people. Imagine leaving school at 11 years old. Maybe some would relish that, but generally you'd find it difficult to get a job. But you see, in those days, you had a moderate education, a basic education, and you got into the workforce as soon as possible. An 11-year-old boy. I mean, you're hardly out of enjoying boyhood at that particular time. And so he was in a grocer's shop for a while, then with a printer, and then a photographer, and he became unemployed at 13. Unemployed at 13. I mean, he's had 2 years' experience in these jobs. And we marvel at that. When you look at where Robert Roberts ended up, we're actually staggered that he left school at that age. But like many men in this generation, they were self-taught, and that discipline of self-education stood them in good stead for their work. Well, being a lad, he went to night school, 11 years old, 12 years old, and he played truant. And he records that when his mother caught him out, the punishment he received was to actually go to his room and let his conscience work upon his mind. And he said, that didn't worry me a bit. And he really appreciated the punishment because it didn't do anything. But his mother decided that he needed a little more education in religious things. So what she did was she took him to another chapel, and this time there's a preacher from the Highlands. So this was a very Scottish man. And Brother Roberts says, I was fairly overcome by his glowing representations of the divine mercy for miserable sinners. So having been rebuked by his mum, he was in a frame of mind to accept the thunder and blood and hellfire of this Highland preacher. And it actually had some effect upon him. He was in tears, as a 13-year-old lad, in tears during the entire discourse, and he went home feeling very much chastened that he was going to go to hell. This was the type of brimstone preaching, actually, of the age, where the preachers would frighten people into almost this morbid fascination with escaping death by being converted by the so-called gospel. And his mum was very happy that he now was converted. This was their sense of conversion, that feeling sorry for themselves and wanting to escape the fires of hell, that in fact was conversion of the day. And it's a very standard approach towards religion through Scotland and England at the time. Well, he writes in his book, My Days and My Ways, that he read voraciously for any material that came across his desk. And interestingly enough, his sister and his grandmother were in receipt of Brother Thomas's periodical Herald of the Kingdom and Age to Come. There's a front piece of that particular book. So what Brother Thomas was doing in the US, the periodicals were going across to the UK. As was indicated by Brother Bernard, he actually spoke in the UK to large audiences, and particularly in Scotland, And that had an effect of the distribution of this particular periodical. This is what he wrote. The experience was extraordinary. Now he's a 13, 14-year-old boy. I expected the usual sort of religious reading, dealing with the experiences of the soul in the light and shade of depressed and joyful feeling. But lo, here was a religious book that denied straight away in the first article that there was such a thing as an immortal soul in man at all, and then denounced the whole religious system built upon such an idea as a superstition, an imposture for which the Bible was not responsible. I was startled. I was awakened. I was filled with a new joy. Now, this is the calibre of the individual that God is bringing to an understanding of the truth. A 13-year-old boy who is deeply religious, who is looking for religious material, and is now presented just at the right time to read this material and be deeply affected by it. Now, I don't know whether you've ever read some of Brother Thomas's writings. Okay, they're reasonably complex. The arguments are tightly argued. Now, this boy is absorbing all of this. I was startled. Amazing reaction, isn't it, from this individual? Well, he sought out, through his sister and his grandmother, he sought out the meeting place of a few brethren in Aberdeen, and he found them in this old castle called Wallace Tower. There's a picture of that. And then up there in the tower, in this grimy, dark, dungeon-like place, in the small room in the castle, was the meeting place of the brethren. And he managed to be able to attend the afternoon meetings, but he still had to attend chapel in the morning. That was the deal which he made with his mother. And then one day, a crisis occurred because he absented himself from the chapel and went to the brothers' meeting. And when his brother said, "Why weren't you at chapel?" he said to his brother, "Because the Bible's not taught there." Well, that news got back to his mother, and his mother was furious, and the punishment was, "You will not be going back to chapel." Well, that suited him fine. It's a very interesting, isn't it, the way in which the strength of the religious feeling at the time was such that even in a family that was rigorously religious, that in the goodness of God there was an opportunity to actually visit the brethren. Well, he needed to improve himself, and on the recommendation of his sister, he begins to learn Latin, and he also begins to learn Pitman's shorthand. I think probably most of us here would remember what shorthand is. It's like squiggles across a page, and all those squiggles represent words. It's a very fast way of taking down dictation. And Brother Roberts learnt that, and apparently was a very proficient shorthand writer. Very legible hand, very fast. He was known in circles to be very proficient at that, and learning this at a very early age stood him in good stead for later on. At the age of 14, he was baptised in the River Dee. 14 years of age. We do get young people who are baptised very early. And Brother Roberts was one of those. They were very mature early. Being sent to work at 11 years old, you grow up very quickly in an adult environment. And there's the original bridge. It was built in 1527, rebuilt in 1718, and widened in 1841. So it was there when Brother Roberts, in fact, was baptised. I don't know whether you ever put your foot in a Scottish river, but boy, you want to be baptised in summer, I can tell you that. And then at 16 years of age came this book, which I think we all are very, very familiar. He devised a system of reading his Bible. He really appreciated the fact that you need to be systematic in your Bible reading, to be able to follow through an epistle, follow through a series of books. And he devised for himself a chart which allowed him to, as we know, read the Old Testament once a year and the New Testament twice. And it became so popular that he began to run sheets off for various people. Here's a 16-year-old lad writing this preface. Salvation depends upon the assimilation of the mind to the divine ideas, principles and affections exhibited in the Scriptures. The process commences with a belief of the gospel, but it is by no means completed thereby. It takes a lifetime for its scope, an untiring diligence for its accomplishment. The mind is naturally alien from God and all his ideas, and cannot be brought at once to the divine likeness. This is a work of slow development, and can only be achieved by the industrious application of the individual to the expression of God's mind in the scriptures of truth. The infallible advice, then, to every man and woman anxious about their salvation: read the scriptures daily. That's a 16-year-old lad who deeply, deeply appreciates the greatness of the Word of God, and also the systematic, industrious application of reading daily. And sadly, it's becoming lost in our community. But Brother Roberts is right. Salvation depends upon the assimilation of the divine mind. 16-year-old appreciated that, and people began to print that off. Well, he had a number of jobs between the ages of 17 through to 20. He firstly was a chemist assistant. There's a photograph there of the actual chemist shop that he was an assistant to, and above that was a printer's place, and the printer was looking for an assistant. The Aberdeen Daily Telegraph, which ran 1,000 copies a day, wanted someone to help with the typesetting and the printing, and Brother Roberts was invited to actually take that at 17 years of age, and he thought, well, I've got an opportunity here to no longer dispense pills and potions, and to actually get into the trade of printing, and that appealed to him. And so he became a journalist and a reporter to some extent, but was forced to leave that position because that newspaper was a little bit shady, a little bit shonky, and he felt on principle that he could no longer work there. But it did provide an opportunity to write. 17 years of age, he writes to Brother Thomas. It was not an epistle such as the author's mature judgment could approve, says this Collier, but it was no doubt the beginning of a mental contact with two men who were like each other, a close bond of confidence. And as Brother Isaac Collier says, here was a youth who could write, full of enthusiasm for the scriptures, and who at such an early age could stand for principle against parents and friends. His development was to be observed with keen interest. And what is interesting is that by the time Brother Roberts was 18, 19 or 20, he was one of the few people whose knowledge was extraordinary in the Bible. The group of brethren and the number of Ecclesial was small, and this young man really was selected time and time again because he had the facile memory of being able to explain the scriptures. And this is evident. 17-year-old lad writing to Brother Thomas. Here's his first presentation. I think probably, brethren, we've often been involved in this kind of situation. I had never previously uttered 2 consecutive sentences otherwise than in conversation. I was called on in rotation with the other members to make some criticism on an essay that had been read. I got up in imitation of the others. I leant forward with my hands helplessly outspread on the table, and my brain went into a whirl. I managed to gasp at a few words and then sat down. Well, brethren, ever been like that? I'm sure we have. In fact, I still think there are some brethren like that. But anyway, it was an attempt, wasn't it, to speak, and he said in itself the effort was a frightful failure, but it was of great importance in breaking the ice. Next time I was called on, the ordeal was not so severe, and gradually the embarrassment diminished with every occasion until I found facility of utterance taking its place. The result was aided by the practice of trying to take down all the speeches delivered at the meeting of the brethren on Sundays. And that shorthand, Pitman's shorthand, became invaluable as he was scribbling every address down, absorbing the information, and then being used to speaking itself. Well, he managed to do a number of odd freelance reporting, and you'll notice that when you read Brother Roberts' writing, it's a very easy style to read, almost journalistic in some ways, and that was the style that he adopted. And he was able in that style to give his first lecture on Daniel chapter 2, Now there's a correlation with Brother Thomas, because Brother Thomas's first talk was also on Daniel chapter 2, on the four beasts, the four metals of Daniel chapter 2. And Brother Thomas had that same interest in prophecy. He managed to visit south of Scotland, a place called Edinburgh, and that's where he met Jane Norrie, whom he was later to marry. But he records in his book that he was disappointed that the attitude of the Edinburgh brethren was not as it was or should be towards Brother Thomas. Now, Brother Thomas had lectured in this area previously, and of course Brother Roberts had absorbed all these lectures and absorbed all this information, was very much a doctor's man, but he found the brethren in Edinburgh not quite the same. And this is going to be significant because later on there's going to be troubles in the region of Edinburgh. He was engaged at 19. Jane Norrie was 27 years old, 8 years his senior. And finally he was recommended to work for the Caledonian Mercury. But he was sacked because he made a transcription error. And sadly, that error in the newspaper ended up in court. And it cost the newspaper money, so he was sacked for that. He learnt his lesson about accuracy. Jane Norrie. I told you they didn't smile in those days. This is what he writes about his wife, his future wife. She was my senior by 8 years, but this was so far from being an obstacle, was the reverse. It imparted to her a weight and sobriety of character that fitted her for the companionship which I desired. Girls of my own age were frivolous. One with whom I had tried to cultivate acquaintance in Aberdeen asked me why I jawed so much about the nations. So she clearly did not like current events. There was no repugnance of this sort to the truth about Jane Norrie. On the contrary, her tastes were all in the line of intellectual and scriptural things. There was an inexhaustible fund of interest in this direction which supplied the material for conversation that never flagged. I met no one like her in this respect, and it was inevitable that our acquaintance should ripen fast. You see where his mind is. His mind is on the scriptures. His mind is on a partner who actually will complement that scriptural interest. And Jane Norrie supplied that. Well, his work took him to Huddersfield. And in actual fact, there was no Ecclesial or meeting place in Huddersfield, and the nearest one was in Halifax, around 12 brethren, 6 or 7 miles away. So every Sunday they walked that 6 or 7 miles. Now, that's quite a way, that's 10 kilometres. I wonder whether we'd be prepared to walk 10 kilometres. They couldn't afford the transport, and only on special occasions did they take the transportation there. But generally, 10 kilometres walk every Sunday. It's quite a dedication, isn't it, for that young couple. We availed ourselves of whatever promising opportunities in other directions presented themselves. And on the left-hand side there would be a typical handbill that Brother Roberts would put out and distribute in the area of Halifax. I don't know how they can crowd so much information on a pamphlet, but those were the bills of the day. And at that time, Brother Roberts, as we have there from the extract, was in fact introduced to open-air preaching. I don't know, brethren, if you've ever done any open-air preaching, but it is an excellent way of learning how to articulate the truth in very small bites to the passing audience. And to be able to take criticism and heckling from the audience is, in fact, I guess, a grueling kind of baptism of fire, but it's certainly a tremendous way of being able to express and to learn the truth. And here Brother Roberts was involved in that. He says at the end of that, our proceedings must have seemed to be ridiculous as he stood on barrels and chairs, this 17, 18-year-old lad, but really it was a wonderful start to the preaching. In Huddersfield, he wrote to Brother Thomas, inviting him to come to Britain, and they managed to raise the sum of £15 5s, which probably would have taken Brother Thomas to the quay, and that's about all. But Brother Thomas responded in a very warm letter in the magazine, and he said that he appreciated that from the deep poverty of Scotland there were people who were interested, even to the extent of very small amounts, to bring him to Britain. It's a wonderfully warm letter which he encouraged Brother Roberts to continue in the work. He moved to another paper, and he had this thing about diet. He lived on a very frugal diet, and by frugal I mean hardly anything, and he became very unwell. So he decided to hasten his marriage, and he continued the diet, and as we have there, he was almost in danger of losing his life. He didn't think this one through very carefully, and people thought that he would actually succumb to the sickness that he was going through, and finally they realised we need to change the diet. They couldn't afford much, and that prompted the very poor diet that they were on, but eventually they got better, they remarried, and there's a photograph of Robert Roberts and Jane Norrie on their wedding day. You know, he describes the preaching effort in Huddersfield, and it was the first of 8 lectures, so they managed to get the bills out, get a bit of enthusiasm going, hire the hall, and Brother Roberts writes this: it was the depth of winter and a very severe season, the snow lying deeply on the ground. When the day for the opening lecture came, we walked to the lane where the schoolroom was, near to the hour of the meeting. How many would be assembled? My companion thought the place would be at least half full, considering the publicity that had been given. It seemed to us that snow was untrodden, and forward we went and reached the door. My wife pushed it open to discover her half-filled room. There was not a solitary soul in the place. This would have been a damper enough in summer weather, but in deep winter it was chilling to freezing point, so far as the reception of the truth had to do with spiritual temperature. So things in the truth are interesting when you think about them. I mean, surely God would bless this work. Surely the place would be packed. That doesn't often work the way in the providence of God. So he said we walked into the room, took our seats at the table at the other end of the room. So you imagine an empty hall, freezing cold winter, snow outside, and no one in the hall except you and your wife. So we sat talking in the resonant emptiness for a short time. Then the door was pushed open. 1 or 2 entered, knocking the snow off their boots, sat down. The state of things was not very encouraging to them, and it would not have taken many minutes to lead them to get up and go out again. But presently a few others came, till at last we had the half room full, anticipated by my companion. And from very small beginnings, began the Ecclesia there at Huddersfield. And that pattern was across the country. Small groups, renting out small rooms, handing out bills, trying to get interest. Phrenology. This was the science of the time. Now, phrenology is the study of the shape of the skull, and by pressing around the skull and all the different indentations in the skull, you can actually determine the character. That was the science of the day. And there were 2 men. These 2 men were called Fowler and Wells, Americans. This here is a Victorian bust of the era of phrenology. And these 2 men went around America and also around Britain reading people's heads. It's pretty exciting, isn't it? But it was the science of the day. And they required shorthand writers. And Brother Roberts was offered a job at double the salary, and an opportunity to travel and possibly even to go to America. And tragically they lost a newborn daughter. And he decided they needed a break and they took the job. It's interesting to read the autobiography when they lost that daughter, and he describes the struggle that he had in saying that his beliefs meant something to him. The churches taught the immortality of the soul. The churches taught that any child who, as long as they were christened, would go to heaven at death. He had to resist all of that, and he had to put into practice the beliefs that he taught. Man was mortal. The child had died, and that was it. And he describes the struggle of that. Well, they took the job and they travelled all the way around the country, and every place they went they managed to meet some of the believers in small groups and build up a rapport across the countryside in the United Kingdom. And here's his first contact with the Birmingham Ecclesia. No organisation. Brother Paul, did you belong to Birmingham at all?
Nothing's changed.
Nothing's changed, you see. Well, they met in a very informal way on Sunday evenings in the upper room, and it's a bathroom of a barber's shop in Summer Lane. And what they did was that they read the doctor's writings, and the room could only hold 16 people. This is the beginning of the Birmingham Ecclesia. And there's a photograph of some of the old Victorian buildings near the barber shop. I don't know whether it's the actual place originally, but it shows you the kind of buildings that were there at the time. Well, Robert Roberts, being a very organised, highly organised man, pointed out the unscripturedness of the chaos that prevailed and recommended the proper incorporation of all immersed friends into a proper, regular breaking of bread, memorial meeting and lecture. And this is one of the strengths of Brother Roberts. He's an organiser. Things can't be in chaos. There has to be order. And as he visited Birmingham through the phrenologists, he was, at their request, asked to lecture. And as he says, it was a very suffocating room, a small affair, on the verge of contemptibility, but it was a beginning. And long experience has taught the wisdom of not despising the day of small things. And that is so true. How many of us have been involved with very small ecclesias, very small beginnings, very small lectures, very small numbers, but we never can we despise the day of small things. This is the germ of greater things. And Brother Roberts learnt that. 5 months on the road brought a change of heart, and he decided that phrenology was no longer his cup of tea, so he decided to rejoin the newspaper, this time at Huddersfield, and there an ecclesia of 6 people was established. And from this very small beginning was a very special book that was printed. It was originally printed as 12 lectures. And the people listening to these lectures, a very systematic approach to the truth, in contrast to the foolishness of church teaching, was in fact so well accepted that broadsheet after broadsheet after broadsheet was printed until finally that became, from penny sheets, to a book entitled Christendom Astray. And like Help Us Israel, Christendom Astray had a huge impact on the people who were given it as they came to the truth, because it systematically, through 12 lectures, went through the doctrines of the Bible, demolishing church teaching and presenting the truth. Quite a remarkable publication from this young brother. Well, Brother Bernard mentions the Civil War, and in 1862, as the Civil War commenced, Brother Thomas no longer felt it appropriate to publish the Herald of the Coming Age. The country was at war, no one was interested in religion, and so he sat down to write the first volume of Eureka. When he arrived, Brother Roberts spent a long time with Brother Thomas taking down notes of his life, and this became the life and works of John Thomas, which is a really excellent read in relation to that. Small things. The man who had lectured to hundreds in Scotland delivered his first address to the brethren, to those 6 or 7 persons in a gloomy baker's shop, and later that day he gave lecture to a half-filled room. Yeah, these are small beginnings, but from these small beginnings, great things emerged. It's impossible to exaggerate the charm of Dr. Thomas's company under our own roof, he said. He was a totally different man from what his writing prepared us to expect. These writings were so pungent, so vigorous, so satirical, and had such a sledgehammer force of argument and denunciation that we'd look for a regular Boanerges, a thunder dealer, a man not only of robust intellect but of combative, energetic, self-assertive turn, whose converse would be largely spiced with explosive vocables. Instead of this, he was quiet, gentle, courteous, well-mannered, modest, absolutely devoid of affectation or trace of self-importance. His calm, lofty, cordial reverence for the Scriptures was very edifying to us. It was so gratifying and so strengthening too to have his fireside answers to the various scriptural questions we had to propound. "Let me see," he would say, "where is that passage?" Turn it up and then proceed in his dignified and incisive way to open to us the Scriptures. Household matters and business shrank into their proper smallness in his company. He was truly a little heaven below, the like of which we rarely since experienced in the rugged journey of probation. He was a deep admirer of the Doctor. Unfortunately, as Brother Thomas went north, the brethren in Edinburgh and Scotland began to poison Brother Thomas's mind against Brother Roberts. And Brother Roberts suggests it's most likely out of envy. In fact, it was healed later when Brother Thomas came back to Brother Roberts after the tour, but it took a while to repair the damage that had been done. And again, this is this problem with Scotland coming through. But before the Doctor returned to the US, he made two important recommendations. The first was that Birmingham really should become the centre of the truth's activity. This is Brother Thomas' assessment of everything that was going on in the UK, and he thought that Birmingham was the best soil for which the truth to grow. And secondly, he suggested that we need a new magazine. And you, Robert Roberts, need to be the editor. Now that shows a great insight of the Doctor, because on both those accounts the truth progressed mightily. Brother Roberts took those on board. Do you know which hall that is? Do you know, Bernard, what hall that is? No? I better pull? No? It's a great photograph though, isn't it? Its epoch is around the Victorian era, just after. And as you can see, the halls themselves are now getting bigger as the circle of brethren is now enlarging. But you know, Brother Thomas, in visiting Scotland, came across a Brother Dowie, George Dowie, and he actually rebuked Brother Roberts in his letter and said to him that you've erred in giving this man the benefit of the doubt in his premises. And we're going to see that George Dowie was a problem. And Brother Thomas saw all through those problems and said to Robert Roberts, you should be dealing with this. You should be dealing with this. And later on he did. Well, he moved to Birmingham and took some freelance work. Unfortunately, it nearly left him destitute until finally he got a job. And slowly but surely the numbers of the Birmingham Ecclesia began to increase slowly. He found a suitable job that allowed him to spend a lot of time on publications. And you'll find in the writings of Robert Roberts that he's not a man who's out for a career. He's not a man who is out to make his mark in the business world. All he wants to do is to get a job that will give him sufficient income to allow the rest of the time to write for the brotherhood. It's a different perspective, isn't it, than today? People go for their careers, people go for the high-flying jobs, the education. But Brother Roberts' emphasis was first on the magazine, and first on the truth, and first on the brotherhood, and he needed just a job to keep that going. And so he published a magazine called The Ambassador of the Coming Age. It was renamed the Christadelphian. And also the first hymn book, The Golden Harp. There were no actual musical notations in this, just the lyrics. But very early on you can see that the brethren themselves were desirous of establishing a hymn book that would give them a particular pattern of music. There were lots of religious tunes out there, lots of religious words out there, but the brethren wanted a distinctive hymn book, something that would reflect their own beliefs, our own understanding. And the Golden Harp was the first of that in the line of a number of hymn books. Well, Brother Thomas was about to publish Eureka Volume 2, so he was looking to come again to Britain, and Brother Roberts became a shorthand writer for the bankruptcy court, which again allowed him more time for speaking and for writing. Brother Paul mentioned this incident in his exhortation about the Catholic apostolic body, the Irvingites, who had lectures in Birmingham on the second coming of Christ. As Brother Paul pointed out, this was a revolutionary topic to have publicly debated in Birmingham. That's the Birmingham Town Hall. Very Grecian kind of structure. And the overflow was there, and as Brother Paul mentioned, Brother Roberts got up on a chair and nearly got knocked out and knocked to the ground and escorted away by 2 policemen. But it caused the brethren to feel strongly about following up on that particular lecture. And they had to raise the enormous cost of £20 to hire the Birmingham Town Hall. And as a result of that, the place was absolutely packed. Absolutely packed. And out of that, 23 baptisms resulted. The Ecclesial is now 68. And the money was eventually found. It was a huge burden upon those brethren, but the money was eventually found. And then the problem of George Dowie appeared. There's a photograph there of George Dowie. The antagonism in Scotland that had been growing now began to develop. And George Dowie introduced the doctrines of the immortality of the soul and a personal devil. It's a little bit more subtle than that. Actually, what he said was that you don't have to deny those things. And that really introduced, I guess, the question of doctrines to be rejected. George Dowie refused to say whether he would receive into fellowship persons who at that time of their immersion believed in the immortality of the soul and eternal torments. He refused to admit that the holding of the immortality of the soul was inconsistent with the holding of the faith of Christ. And this was the first rupture within the brotherhood. And if any of you have been involved in ecclesial ruptures, it is not a very nice experience. Brother Roberts had to lead the withdrawal from the Edinburgh Ecclesia. And in fact, when he went up to the Aberdeen Ecclesia, he was taken to task. He was accused of judging the brethren. And Brother Roberts had to point out that we're not allowed to judge motives, but we certainly can judge issues. And we need to discern what's right and what's wrong. But he was taken to task by some of the brethren in relation to that. He said an effort should doubtless be put forth to reclaim those who are in error, but where the efforts fail, disassociation by withdrawal is natural and inevitable. Division is the inevitable concomitant of an uncompromising adherence to the truth. And from that, as I said, came a declaration in which there were doctrines to be rejected. Every affirmative proposition has a converse. Every yes has a no. If a man is not prepared to accept the no, it shows his yes is not worth much. And that's why we have the doctrines to be rejected in our statement of faith. Every yes has a no. Very wise provision there. And it came from George Dowie, who said, well, you don't have to declare a no. The third visit came. And once again, the lectures continued. And the time came for Brother Roberts to actually be paid editor of the Christadelphian. It's quite a challenging move. Brother Thomas had resisted being a paid editor. He didn't want to be incumbent on any particular individual. But the brethren felt at this time that the position of the Christadelphian in giving so much advice and giving so much good exposition, that needed to continue to develop the brotherhood and to instruct the brotherhood. It's interesting, you know, when back in those days, there are articles there by Sister Jane Roberts on health and how to wash and bathe and how to look after children. You see, because people come into the truth from some of the poorest parts of Birmingham didn't have those life skills. And some of the advice in the Christadelphian at this time was on basic life skills. The magazine was an important part of developing a faithful community in those days. In 1871, the news came of the doctor's death. And it was the saddest and blackest day in Brother Roberts' life. This was the man who Brother Bernard said, managed to shift all the rubble, get rid of all the refuse, and bring the pristineness of the truth to light. Brother Roberts was deeply dependent on Brother Thomas, and now he was gone. And Brother Roberts is all by himself, as it were. It was a huge blow, a massive blow. And then further controversy hit the Brotherhood. In 1873, a man named Edward Turney of Nottingham, along with David Hanley, issued a pamphlet entitled 32 Questions and Answers Concerning Jesus Christ. He wrote, "Brethren and friends, whatever I have taught by mouth or pen contrary to the views of Jesus Christ herein set forth, I now renounce." It's called the renunciation theory. He renounced his teaching on what the atonement was all about. And the next night, Brother Roberts responded with a book entitled The Slain Lamb. So here's the second shock to the Brotherhood. And this time it's on the nature of Jesus Christ. Edward Turney started a rival magazine in opposition, but it flickered out because Edward Turney died shortly after. But what it did was, it left Brother Roberts severely ill. You can't go through this kind of cataclysm in the ecclesial life without physically being affected. And Brother Roberts was deeply affected by all of this, deeply affected. But the works coming from his pen were mighty indeed. Like Brother Thomas, he was a prolific writer, and those writings are astounding. In 1877, he wrote this book on the Russo-Turkish War, and this particular publication was sent to Gladstone. Friendly face on the screen. Gladstone was a very prominent politician. He was the opposition leader at the time. And Gladstone responded favourably to Robert Roberts' pamphlet. Well, of course, the brethren took this and published it. And this was a great way of preaching the truth. The opposition thought that this pamphlet had some useful information about the Middle East questions. He wrote The Ways of Providence, 13 lectures on the Apocalypse. Britain moved into Egypt and caused great excitement in the Brotherhood. 1883, The Visible Hand of God, The Trial. And then in 1883, that most invaluable work, The Conduct and Guide, which we know as the Ecclesial Guide today. Brother Roberts was involved in a number of debates. I couldn't get a picture of the first one, so a rather blank expression there on the screen. Louis Stern, an Orthodox Jew, he debated about Jesus being the Son of God. Edward Hine, the man who was a British Israelite, Brother Roberts, in fact, in 3 nights demolished the man. And his most famous debate was with Charles Bradlaugh, an English politician who was the chief of the humanists, the agnostics. And that debate, whilst Brother Roberts didn't win outright, and there appears to certainly have been a very keen interest in this, Charles Bradlaugh many years later wrote and said that Brother Roberts was probably the best adversary he debated against. But all of this brings the truth to the public notice in Britain. Debates, contention, this is the apostolic way, isn't it? And those debates were remarkable. And then comes another issue within the Brotherhood, and this time it comes from within. Robert Ashcroft was a former minister, and he was converted to the truth, and the brethren were delighted at the fact that they actually could in fact convert a minister. Robert Ashcroft had to leave all his salary behind, and Brother Roberts felt sorry for him and therefore brought him into the work of the magazine. He was criticised by some for doing that, but he felt it was the right thing to do. This individual had no means of income, no means of support, no skills. He was a clergyman, and therefore brought into the magazine. However, tragically, this man began to preach the partial inspiration of the Scriptures. He put a magazine out, and the first issue said the Scriptures were not actually inspired, partially only. Now, Brother Roberts felt very strongly on this, and he dissolved the Ecclesia, established a new Ecclesia on the Birmingham Men's Statement of Faith. He was criticised in the way he handled this by some members of the Brotherhood, but he felt very strongly that if you deny the inspiration of Scriptures, you might as well throw the Bible out. Brother Roberts had a very generous view to the brotherhood, and unfortunately, as Brother Isaac Collier says, he was not a businessman. You may have heard the sugar disaster. It was a scam. Brother Roberts didn't know that, the brotherhood didn't know that, and Brother Roberts contributed to this, believing that you could in fact make sugar through an electric process. And if you do that, then the money would come back, could go back into the truth, could go back into publication, could go back into lectures. His motives were great. But it was a scam. And then Brother J.J. Andrew began to introduce error on the resurrectional responsibility. Now, you have to think, brothers and sisters, that all of this is the providence of God. The truth is being matured to another level beyond Brother Thomas. Brother Andrew was in fact a highly capable young brother. In fact, he assisted Brother Roberts in many articles. Highly intelligent, highly scriptural, highly capable. He was a lawyer by trade. He was very, very competent in the scriptures. But tragically, he began to raise other language, other issues. And in the end, he wrote a book called The Blood of the Covenant, and he said in that book that only the baptized will be raised. If you're not baptized, you won't be raised. And this, of course, is contrary to the teaching of the Scripture. Accountability, or the basis of resurrection responsibility, is the knowledge of the truth and the calling to that knowledge. We can't define the level of knowledge that makes a person responsible. That's for God to decide. But J.J. Andrews said, no, the basis of resurrection responsibility is baptism only. There were great debates on this issue, and unfortunately the brotherhood split again. You would have thought that Brother Roberts would have learnt from the sugar disaster, but there was the unbreakable glass scam. And he, again, to his embarrassment, realised that he'd lost the brethren money. And he tried to recoup that. All of that pressure made him very ill, and he received an invitation to visit Australia and New Zealand. There's a picture there of Thomas Williams. Thomas Williams was an individual who, in America, took up some of the teachings of J.J. Andrew. In fact, the basis of the amended and unamended group in America stems from this particular division. The unamended are those who followed Thomas Williams' teaching on the resurrection through baptism. Well, we reach our final journey. He visited Australia and New Zealand and tragically died unexpectedly all by himself in a hotel room with no one there except himself at the age of 59, worn out and ill. Brother C.C. Walker journeyed to the USA to arrange his burial, and he writes in his book there that when the coffin was lowered to the grave and this filled up, it was crowned by some loving hands with a large and beautiful floral emblem displaying in violet colour on a snow white background the simple legend, "Our Brother." And I think that summarises the view that the brotherhood had of Brother Roberts, our brother. He was an indefatigable worker, moving around week by week, exhorting, lecturing, teaching, encouraging and writing. He was our brother. And whilst Brother Thomas discovered the truth, Brother Roberts confirmed and established it. And we'd be very, very thankful that the promise of God, we inherit the results of those labours. So in conclusion, I know I have got over time, but in conclusion, these are the lessons we learn from Brother Roberts. Firstly, he used every opportunity to preach and speak about the truth. So should we. He saw everything in his life in the context of the truth. There was nothing else that came close to the priority of the truth. He managed his working life to fit into the truth. He learned in the face of controversy that the truth of God is the rule of friendship and communication. Controversy made him ill. Controversy, in the promise of God, honed the truth to the glory and the beauty that we experience now. But there was friendship and companionship in all of that. He greatly valued the writings of Brother Thomas. and so should we. And although flawed like all men, he is a great inspiration. He's left a legacy of writings that we should be reading. Ways of Providence, a wonderful book. Books that can strengthen us in the things of God. On his gravestone, next to John Thomas, is the inscription that this brother continued the work begun. May we do the same. Thank you.